As 2025 comes to a close, it feels like we're living in two completely different worlds at the exact same time. Over on Wall Street, you've got the champagne corks flying as the markets just keep climbing. But in Washington, they're sounding the alarm, pointing to what they see as a massive long-term threat on the horizon. So how can both of these things be happening at once? Well, let's break it down.
Okay, so the first story, the one that has everybody so optimistic, it all starts with this number right here. The Federal Reserve just cut interest rates. Again, for the third time in a row. For the markets, this is like hitting the jackpot. It's a huge green light, basically a signal from the Fed that the good times can keep on rolling.
And the reaction from investors? Well, it's been pretty wild. I mean, just look at what the big players are saying. The message is crystal clear. It's time to get in on the action. Analysts are practically falling over themselves to recommend everything from stocks to real estate. The thinking is pretty simple, right? With the Fed cutting rates, the only direction to go is up.
So, here's how we're going to unpack this major disconnect. First, we're going to look at why the markets are celebrating. Then, we'll shift gears and look at the storm clouds that Washington is seeing. We'll dive deep into something they're calling the China Shock 2.0. We'll explore the new frontiers of global competition. And finally, we'll see what the experts think we should actually do about all this.
All right, let's start with the story that's got Wall Street so excited. It's a pretty straightforward narrative. The U.S. economy managed to avoid a recession, inflation is finally cooling off, and now the Fed is rewarding everyone with lower interest rates. I mean, it's basically the economic hat trick everyone was hoping for.
And you can really see here why investors are just so happy. It's like all the pieces of the puzzle are fitting together perfectly. You've got the Fed cutting rates, a strong economy that didn't break, and inflation finally taking a breather. For an investor, this is the perfect Goldilocks scenario. Not too hot, not too cold. It's pretty much a perfect recipe for making money.
And this is where the record suddenly scratches to a halt. Because while the markets are throwing a party, a completely different and honestly a much darker conversation is happening over in Washington. They're not focused on the next quarter's earnings. They're looking at the next 10 years, and they are seriously worried about the very foundations of the global system.
And that conversation is being driven by this document, the 2025 Annual Report from the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. This thing landed on Congress's desk in late November, and let me tell you, it reads less like a dry economic report and more like a five-alarm fire drill.
Now here's the kicker. This wasn't some partisan fight. Every single member of this commission, we're talking Democrats and Republicans, signed off on this thing, unanimously. I mean, getting that kind of agreement in Washington these days is like finding a unicorn. It tells you that this isn't just politics as usual. They all see this as a real, serious national threat.
You see, this commission has one very specific and very important job: to connect the dots between the U.S. economy's relationship with China and America's own national security. So they're not just looking at trade balances and profits. They're asking, how does all this economic activity affect our ability to stay safe and secure as a nation?
Okay, let's get to the absolute heart of this report's warning. The Commission is ringing the alarm bell about what it's calling the China Shock 2.0, a new wave of economic disruption that they believe could be even bigger than the first one we saw decades ago.
So what on earth is China Shock 2.0? Well, basically, it's a giant flood of super cheap goods pouring out of China. But this isn't about fair competition. This is about the Chinese government pumping enormous subsidies into its factories, creating way more stuff than its own people can possibly buy. And what do you do with all that extra inventory? You dump it on the rest of the world at rock-bottom prices.
And just look at these numbers to see how massive this is. China's trade surplus, that's the difference between what it sells to the world and what it buys, is on track to top a staggering $1 trillion. To put that into perspective, that's bigger than the entire economy of many countries. This isn't a ripple, it's a tidal wave.
And the report is brutally clear about the consequences. This isn't just about losing some factory jobs. They use the word predatory. They're warning that this wave could literally hollow out American manufacturing and that of our allies. And a strong industrial base, well, that's not just a nice thing to have, it's absolutely essential for national security.
But this competition isn't just happening in factories. No, the report paints a much bigger picture of a conflict that's being fought on multiple fronts, in our supply chains for critical goods, way up in outer space, and deep in the digital world of cyberspace.
So this isn't random. The report shows a grand strategy with some incredibly ambitious goals.
We're talking about everything from cornering the market on things like critical minerals and pharmaceuticals to becoming the top military power in Asia. And all the while, they're using what's called gray zone tactics, actions that are aggressive and coercive, but just shy of an outright act of war.
Let's just zoom in on one of these new battlegrounds for a second. Space. The numbers are just astounding. China has launched over 1,000 satellites in the last 10 years alone. And these aren't just for checking the weather. They are building a vast military network in the sky for surveillance, for communication, and yes, for targeting.
And this quote from the report lays out the terrifying military logic behind it. China is actively developing weapons designed to take out U.S. satellites. The strategy is chillingly simple. If a conflict ever does break out, their first move might not be to launch a missile, but to attack our eyes and ears in space, effectively blinding the U.S. military before the fight even gets started.
So, let's just put these two totally different realities side by side. You've got the market, with its eyes glued to the next quarter, absolutely terrified of missing out on the next big rally. And then you have Washington, looking at the next decade, terrified of losing the entire industrial and security foundation that the country is built on. It's like one person is enjoying a beautiful day at the beach, totally ignoring the tsunami sirens wailing in the distance.
So after this really alarming diagnosis, what's the cure? Well, the good news is the report doesn't just drop a huge list of problems on our doorstep and walk away. It actually offers a pretty concrete roadmap for how Congress can start to get a handle on these massive systemic risks. Okay, let's look at 3 of the biggest proposals. First, they say the U.S. needs to get way more serious about enforcing its rules. That means creating one powerful agency to handle things like sanctions and export controls. Second, we have to build up our own resilience. We simply cannot be dependent on China for life-saving medicines or other critical materials. And third, we've got to protect our critical infrastructure, like banning Chinese-made components from our power grid to defend against cyber attacks.
And believe me, that's just the tip of the iceberg. The full report lays out 28 specific recommendations. It's not just a warning, it's a full-on playbook for policymakers designed to get the U.S. playing offense instead of defense in this long-term competition.
And this final quote from the report just drives home exactly what is at stake here. This is so much bigger than just one industry. Losing our leadership in a critical domain like space, the report warns, could unravel everything: our national security, our influence around the world, and our technological edge.
Which really brings us to the final, massive question we all have to ask ourselves. As Wall Street pops the corks and celebrates another good year, are we all so focused on those short-term gains that we're completely missing the long-term systemic dangers just over the horizon? That is the trillion-dollar question we need to be thinking about as we head into 2026.